Cindy Patton. I'm Hans Huang. I'm from Center for Study of Sociology at NCU. I'm here to introduce you Professor Cindy Patton, who teaches at the Social Anthropology Department at Fraser University in Canada. She is a world-renowned health expert, specializing in many areas, including first and foremost AIDS, and then women's health and community health. She's published tons of books. The first one that came out in 1985, Sex and Germs, The Politics of AIDS, was one of the very earliest monograph that taking on the politics of AIDS. Then several books came out subsequently, all around basically cultural studies of AIDS. These include Inventing AIDS from 1990. Last Served, Gendering the HIV Pandemic, talking about women and AIDS. That came out in 1994. Then Fatal Advice, How Safe-Sex Education Went Wrong, came out in 1996, published by Duke University Press. And then year 2000 is Globalizing AIDS, by University of Minnesota. And she's also, it's really difficult to classify Cindy because she got a book on cinema as well. two books on cinema. In 2007, she published Cinematic Identity, Anatomy of a Problem Film on U.S. Civil rights movement, and then a small book on gay porn called L.A. Plays Itself, Always in the Sand. She's also edited a few volumes, including Queer Diaspora in year 2000, Global Science, Women's Health in 2008, and lastly, Rebirth of the Clinic, Places and Agents in Contemporary Healthcare. She's been here in Taiwan twice. She's closely associated with the Sex Center at NCU, and she's gave 2 lecture series before. The first one in 2006, so it was 1996, and then the last time she was here was 2014. That one topic was on bioethics, which is related to the topic she's giving today. She's also served for many years on Research Ethics Board, and for the past few years, she's been researching on issue of pre-AIDS gay public health in the U.S. And also over the past, as she's been involved in community healthcare, she's been developing this research that's just called anti-research research. It's teaching people in community how to resist, to talk back to researchers who's lost their tracks. Something that she will be talking about today. Yesterday at the NCU, she gave this the first talk of this series, Feeling Science on Moral Fatigue. Today, she will focus on one case study, one that related to housing trial that simplified deeply problematic as this one. As a topic of today's show, human rights, can research topic violate human rights. And I guess she will expand a bit more from yesterday, which takes on Bourdieu's theory of state and bureaucrats. Today will be more focused on bioethics and all the ethical issues involved in this particular case that was from 2009, that was done in Canada in several sites. Okay, so I'll just let's just welcome Professor Cindy.
I think there are sort of several moving parts in my work, and I've been a Bourdieuian for a very, very, very long time. So my earlier work really focused at, like 25 years ago, focused at the level of the social movements and their efforts to gain some kind of traction within the political domain. Over time, I became more, I won't say more interested in, but equally interested in supranational organizations and supranational processes. So today, one of the axes will be thinking about the UN Declaration of Human Rights and some subsequent elaborations of that initial 1948 document. And it links together with questions of research ethics. So I'm going to spend more time today than I did yesterday kind of talking about the detail, some of the details of the requirements within research ethics that the current use of randomized controlled trials to study social issues consistently violate. This is a case from Canada. At the time that the trial was struck in 2009 or until 2012, there was no other trial like it in the world. Now there are a lot of trials like this. In fact, at one point, the researchers from the Canadian trial published an article that was, it was an academic article. It was vetted through the usual academic processes, but it purported to show an impact from their study in terms of other people taking up the same research design. So it wasn't about the content of the actual research, but they were arguing that our research design is successful because see all these other people are taking it up. So there's been a kind of internal motor. Once one of these studies starts, other people become convinced that they need to do the study as well. So if you search randomized controlled trial now on the web, you'll find many, many companies, some of them global, that are basically doing often short time frame randomized controlled trials on social issues. So this is a really big change within applied social sciences from 15 years ago. So I talked a little bit yesterday about how some of the reasons why that happened. So I'm hoping to provide a little bit more detail today, and I'm going to touch on a few other elements. One thing I will add in is some of the activism on the part of research subjects themselves that happened in Vancouver, not in relationship to this particular trial, but happening simultaneously in relationship to some other research projects. So I want to begin with two quotes. The first quote is from the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, and it reads, "Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services." And I want to now give you a quote from 2011. This is from the website of the Mental Health Commission of Canada, who struck the housing project that I'm going to talk about. So they say, as of October 2011, over 2,200 people have become, 2,200 people have become project participants, and over 1,030 people now have homes. Okay. In May 2006, the United Nations Economic and Social Council published its final report on member state compliance with the International Covenant on Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights. The covenant, signed in 1966 and put into effect a decade later, was a significant clarification of that original 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But like similar international agreements, enforcement of the covenant is complicated because while all countries allow periodic evaluation of their compliance, only those who sign this thing called an optional protocol acknowledge the right of their citizens to file complaints against the United Nations, or file complaints against the country to the United Nations. So the optional protocol for this particular covenant that covers housing and a bunch of other things was being hammered out during the time frame in which the trial was occurring. And so by 2010, 45 nations had joined the optional protocol, which allowed for enforcement, but Canada was still debating whether it would join the optional protocol or not. So this is for those of you who don't know international law processes, this is how all of the covenants work. The original covenant is written. It takes usually about 10 years for a group of countries to decide they're going to sign it, and then the optional protocol takes another decade or so before the countries who've signed the original covenant agree on what the enforcement mechanism is going to be. And then people sign or don't sign. Typically, the US is one of the first countries to sign anything, but it never signs the optional protocols. Canada generally signs the optional protocols. But in this case, I think in part because of the trial I discussed, there was some concern about how much enforcement they want. I'll just note that the EU countries have largely either signed the optional protocol or already incorporated housing rights requirements within their own constitutions. So within the EU, pretty much everybody has a legal right to housing that's litigatable through one mechanism or another. Now, Canada sees itself as a very progressive and socialist country. In fact, one that early advocated for housing rights on the global stage, including the widely publicized and architecturally famous habitat buildings that were built for the 1967 Montreal Expo. Perhaps you've seen pictures of these. And a subsequent housing conference called Habitat 1 that was held in fact in Vancouver in 1976. So it was really humiliating for Canada to be dressed down by that first monitoring committee's report, which castigated Canada for failure to provide housing, particularly for Aboriginal people, also for women, but castigated the housing situation generally. And so it urged Canada to follow the efforts of its EU peers and incorporate housing rights into the language of national, provincial, and municipal law. So, and I just can't underscore how embarrassed Canada was. This was like a really big deal, and there were tons and tons of articles in the major Canadian newspapers saying, Canada's shame, the world looks at us and our housing situation. So in response to this, the government created a whole bunch of new initiatives around housing. And housing advocates quickly began to develop a series of legal cases under what is called the Canadian Charter of Rights. The Canadian Charter of Rights is a relatively recent document in Canada. So Canada became a nation separated from England with no Bill of Rights, no Declaration of Rights. So it was only in the 1980s when people began to say, wait a minute, we need to have some kind of mechanism like other democracies have that enumerates what our rights are as citizens. So the legal issues around, they're called charter challenges, are still a very new and kind of confusing area of law because there are very few principles for these. So the housing advocates began quickly saying, okay, now the world has said we're bad, and so we're going to start filing these charge of these complaints against the government under our own existing law, even before new laws are put in place. So there was quite a bit of flurry happening. And so one of the initiatives came from Mental Health Canada and Health Canada. These are two separate but interrelated government agencies. And they decided to step into this kind of national crisis around housing by creating some kind of research project to do with housing. And I'll say that it was really unclear in the beginning what the project was going to be. And so many people, including myself, were approached by the lead researchers saying, we are going to get this huge chunk of money, who should we study? And so at one point someone came to me and said, we want to study people with HIV who have psychiatric diagnoses. And I said, do you mean mental illness or a psychiatric diagnosis? They said psychiatric diagnosis. And I checked with friends of mine, and there were about 80 people who fit that category. I said, this is not a sufficiently large category. And they already have housing programs available, so you should find someone who doesn't have an existing housing program. Okay, so there was lots and lots of discussion and debate in all 5 of the cities where the project would eventually occur. And then kind of much to everyone's surprise, sort of overnight the thing became launched. And the publicity said that the new project, which was called At Home Chez Soi, because everything in Canada has to be bilingual. I tend to call it the Chez Soi project. The At Home Chez Soi project was designed to collectively develop a body of evidence to help Canada become a world leader in providing services to homeless people living with mental illnesses. So from the beginning of the crafting of the project, the publicity around it emphasized this kind of idea that Canada would be a world leader. So this is a very, obviously betrays this anxiety about having just been shown up to be these quite bad players within the housing domain.